This is the fifth reading of Embedded Contradiction and Issuance of Dissonance into Contemporary Philosophy, an Introduction to Modular Truth by Michael Fahl, read by the author. We're picking this up. Anything that can be seen in a trend or having a trend line or trending can be noted as a trend whence 3 points accord to a straight line. In the stock market, these are called trend lines. For every trend, even conceivable trends, one could either illustrate or posit that a trend occurs there. These lines generally go up, down, or horizontal, as the arrow of time on most trendline graphs have time times arrow, read left to right, such that the idea of a vertical line shows no change over time. Like this writing itself, topics shift drastically and appear to hold not continual coherence on initial read upon the orthodox read. A trend line of when coherent points reemerge in a writing is to help facilitate topical tangent points to a trend line which connects topics. This is an exercise in reading through the text for greater grasps of meaning, greater grasps at an author's intent. So any overlap or refolding comparing the current trend next to a previous trend of same market constant of trend lines can yield an angle when not parallel. Because an angle can be discerned, a stellated extension of any angle can be illustrated, conceived. So comparative trends can and do yield first an angle and then a uniform stellation. These are trend lines. Angle, geometric stellation. Geometric stellation is used to speak of logical properties, such as speaking of inverse relationship in logical spaces. The remnant of illustrating stellation is that secondary domains are defined. These domains can then be denoted and placed into logical set theory. The inverse square law denoting distance in space-time yields the measure of the new domain in terms of its spatio-temporal measure. But more specifically in geometric dilution, in terms of 3D measures of radiating ideas. If this was a trend line measuring of intensities of emphasis in one's speech patterns, of grammar or social demeanor in public social observations, then the trend line and its inverse squared radiation and diminishment may be ascribed in a way that auditory accents and dialects supposedly inform one of the regional or provincial dialects and may inform one also of a boundary limit in thinking, understanding, or behavior in the first place, in summed up with i.e. people in that area are like this so-and-so. In the third place would be political behavior defined by holomorphism, defining a boundary limit of definitions such that Mexican and South American economic refugees are fleeing for their lives and are hence refugees nonetheless, but they are classed differently than Somalis, Syrian, or other continent, non-land border continent peoples as immigrants, and are divided up in definition within the boundaries of their illegal immigrant or legal immigrant status, but they may also be appropriated to the legal domain as refugees, such that the very physical domain from which they were fleeing was not simply conducive to their lifestyle preferences, but to their very survivorship. Their lives are in grave peril. Whole political lines, policies, and definitions can be defined via the emphasized speech patterns, inflections, and accented words and word patternings articulation. And some of what is and isn't in the law books appropriated to accompany what could be meant by conjoining "We are going to build a great wall between the U.S. and Mexico, and we want people to come here, and we want them to come legally, and these are illegal immigrants. The legal ones are good," according to Donald Trump. So perhaps fleeing refugees need asylum, and they cannot apply for asylum because they are too poor or ostracized from internet access, so can't even look up the address as to where to send the first appeal for asylum. But regardless of that, the economic poverty of other countries in relation to the U.S. is different than that of the relation of an individual who is the last one in a ghost town, and survivability. Survivability based on accessible resources to sustain one's biology. Most people don't notice the crossover and are a vestigial artifact of race-based nationalism. Veers its head and reveals its ugly face where another human's holomorphic soul is lesser than yours, or you're perceived like in-group. As a side note, we are in a post-constitutional America now. Snowden revealed this fact. "You're not playing ball, Mike." I say, "Yes, I know, I'm playing triangle or cone." If two identical twins have kids from different women or men, whereby the offspring, the kids being cousins, would also take on the direct genetic relationship as half-siblings. Soundationalism is not so much merely a rope-a-dope called "Let the Wookiee Win." It is also rhymes with soundationalism, the areas of being which are sound. The phrase "slinging your shit" refers to street salesmen who hustle, not hustlers who are selling you actual shit either. Shit is a referred name of your product, even if you devalue your own, humble your own, to talk about the lowest common denominator in the group, the one who sinks in. But the phrase "slinging your shit" is less appropriate to authors, even authors who attempt sell their books' writings. A break apart from language to its correspondence, the continental philosophers Heidegger and Derrida mention the erasure of the symbol, but Derrida speaks of the sign and the signified, and here I mean to focus on the signified. The sign or symbol that represents a signified can line up in a series such as to found a topic of conversation, a topic of discourse. The signifieds which correspond to one's body, whereby one's body is known haptically and sensually, these corresponding words associate with the senses. And it is here where the word sensical, sensicality, and what I would term sensicality. The synthesis of new words, which are not about the concerns of translating meaning from one language to another, but instead to denote a fictional non-fiction space whereby a sui generis term might arrive, be positive, be generated, created, which defines or describes something that could be translated descriptively and appropriately to other languages. Where the Dendelin sphere crosses the hourglass point is where the parabola shape is noted. This is an illustration of the Dendelin sphere. We have one on the bottom of an intersecting plane of the parabola, and one on the top, and as the plane rises, the top ball becomes smaller. Down here we could have a larger ball. Okay, back to the text. Where supposed infinitesimal regress occurs, and where it is retracted or exhausted is pondered. And side note by me, the author, if the Dendalian ball raises towards the venturi without having the venturi actually close to an intersection, right, where it still remains a venturi, you could say that the ball, as it approaches the venturi, becomes infinitesimally small, or in this case, where we suppose infinitesimal regress occurs and where it is retracted or exhausted, it is pondered. Distinct contradiction. This is a circle and not a circle. Broad contradiction. If something is blue, it is also red. Bunches of assumptions are what needs to be continually unpacked. I didn't say it was a tautology, I said it was a contradiction. Inductive hypothesis. 1. If the ground was wet, it was either raining or someone sprayed water. Number 2, it is wet. Number 3, ergo, either it rained or someone sprayed water. The point of TAs is to show that a specific claim P is a necessary condition for the proposition Q, that the only way it can be true is due to the truth of some proposition Q. Why not say that a specific claim P has a necessary condition for the proposition Q, such that the only way P can be true is due to the structure, form of proposition Q, and totally put the term true and truth under erasure. About subalternation, illustration, note diagram at this particular blog spot. Side note, I'm stopping the reading for a moment as the author. The text can be picked up in its current form, still not a completely well-edited version, at MikeFahl.com. That's MikeFahl.com. You can download the PDF there, and then the hyperlinks within the text, you can open those up. Okay, back to the text. Notice how the middle line is contradictories and the top line are contradictories or contraries. Also note how the diagram of subaltern posted here does not use the term contradictions proper. Modern logic differs slightly away from its classical use and orthodoxy of using the word contradiction. The top line denotes, I suppose, that which is contrary and which might be a proper classical contradiction. Every S is P, contrary to no S is P. So between the top line and the middle definition line, we see a mirror of kind. The geometry of philosophy, the smallest unit is a triangle. Concerning the giddier cases in statistical probability, what are the odds approaching this writing thinking that it was a book opposed to merely a PDF printed out and then buying it as used philosophy book to find out it has cum stains in it? Disposition relative to intentions. The axiom, this is a quote, the axiom of uniformity is deeply appealing, and something of that sort is probably a methodological imperative, but I see no reason to suppose it is a necessary truth. Why should the world not be disjoint and ultimately diverse? Attempts to make ontological essays with universal application, that is, attempts to find categories, must give up the old metaphysical ambition to find necessary truths in ontology. There is no ground for the old claim that there is only one self-consistent ontology, and therefore no ground for the claim that metaphysics is a body of a priori quasi-logical truths. Metaphysics is the most general department of a common inquiry into both particularities and the generalities of existence, which is a seamless web from the particular claims of natural history onward through ever-increasingly general thesis in the theoretical and mathematical sciences. Abstract Particulars by Keith Campbell, Abstract Particulars. People seem to turn their blind spot onto a true contradiction in preference for an agnosticism towards what must eventually bear out a non-contradictory truth. Rejection of bivalence. Gap is the king of France is bald. Glute is more than one truth value. Below is the orthographic 2D Venn diagram of A and not A, left row. At the bottom is a filled math space where contradiction have attempted to ballpark Russell and Cantor's, etc. paradoxes with notions of proper classes, above mere classes and sets, which allow for predicate functions of a variable to stage its invariance so local or special domains on a field have exceptional properties. The center now is three-dimensional, extruding of the not A domain, where the top figure is a traditional extruding like cylinder. In the right row shows the hyperbola, where the bottom figure shows the domain of glute and gaps indicated, where the hyperbola is within its relational and perspective to the A domain. Here's the illustration. An orthodoxy held by religious people is that God is one with truth. An orthodoxy of many contemporary philosophers is that speak about God is that God knows all truth propositions. Some religious people say that the laws of logic are one-to-one or isomorphic with God, and that God would not have any contradictions, less perhaps moral. Yet the ongoing non-recovery from contradiction would have mathematics and logicians at odds with the idea that if God is mathematical, then God must also be or have an aspect of contradictory. Therefore, I say that God knows all false propositions as well as knowing all truth propositions. God knows all, and God allows for his own exception and exceptional domains where analytical contradictions, proper classes, exceptional classes to reside. Therefore, God is either one-to-one with truth, where truth includes true contradictions, or God's relationship with truth is underdetermined. I wonder if all nouns are to be observed as verbs, not simply objects in an entropic world, but ideal objects. Even the idea of quantities. Can someone cross their eyes and see a single as a double? Can't one bifurcate their mind's eye and confuse quantities within their mind? Only one wanting and willing to enter insanity would hold such a directed will. Yet, can't all signifieds, entities of the mind, not also have a meta running alongside it, para to the thought? Where meta means a metaphor or thought about the object happening concurrently, and aren't some able to run a meta on a meta? Electrons, covalent shells, valence shells, runabout, centric, and alongside about protons and neutrons, other particles, and these shells may run about one another 4 deep. Double bubble, free form nonsuch. Why the art of discourse and folding and an ethics of give and take with all things, ramble, should be within the boo book perhaps. What isn't under flux, opposed to erasure or a text or eschewing one's audio senses? We can and we need to accent, make bold, italicized, emphasis, inflate, bloat, and conflate the word, particularly, not to analyze the word, but to great attention. At the slight erasure of all context, all other words or elements of possible focus, in the text or in one's world. I wonder if the duplication of an identity. I wonder of the duplication of an identity. A preference for conflation, a preference for contradiction in social discourse, freedom, such that the only social deference isn't within so other inclusive relegation of text words, nonviolent expression, not all words, the mode of the presentation of the real versus the positing that which is said to be real. Pneuma. Absolute. If the absolute is a kind of completed and telos, what is to be said about what has to be left behind, the absolver. Next chapter. Contra to contradictions are non-contradictions. Contra to contradictions are non-contradictions, and so here we notice that there is a huge historic preference towards non-contradiction status. If contradictions are merely unknown differences which are not currently fettered out, then one might preference that contradiction as only worthy of a solution, a fettering out the difference, and is preferred to be approached in an agnostic fashion, opposed to supposing that the condition of the contradiction is unsolvable at some lowest common denominator of one's consideration or considerable abilities. These contradictions, if not able to be fettered out, can exhaust those who hunt for the considerable difference between what two variables, elements, theories, which are said to be in contra to one another. The diletheist has preference over those whom believe that no possible difference can be denoted, and that two true contradictions is available beyond mere paradox. This is to say, beyond merely denoting the dialogue about the consequence of following the truth in such and such manner, whereby this statement is false, is redelivered via a quest for the truth of the matter. By following up meta-narratives, i.e., if the statement is true, then it is also false or incoherent to its own stabilized meaning. This requires that the person confronting a paradox stab into the paradox with a quest of the truth, or a quest for the case. This can bring up a tangential meta-narrative question as to why we seek to find the truth, the case of the matter. We have a preference towards truth-seeking and against accepting contradictions. Whether the contraction are proper and true and accepted as such, or whether they are approached with the assumption that the truth of all the matter will, in fact, be found out between the contrary elements' propositions, believing dogmatically that unknowns can be or will be knowns. This is to say what I mentioned above, namely that one will assume that a contradiction is merely a problem to be solved when one has the necessary resources of consideration. and such that a difference between aspects or elements of interpretations of the variable proposition and propositional elements come to light. The anxiety which comes from sustaining difference in one's mind is relieved too early, too often, with the idea that the difference will eventually end and clarity will be apprehended. Clearly, humans tend and trend to have a desire, at least in modern age, if not throughout the history of human language and language translation, to prefer a non-sympathy towards contradictions when confronted with them. To deny truth-seeking might be claimed as a denial of human nature. What is the overarching hope for scaling geometry-linked domains via Dendelian sphere through hyperbolic hourglasses? It is to suppose that all two-dimensional intersections found via stellation off of any triangle yield an opposite domain from which the Dendelian sphere or sand through the hourglass can pass. And what of this? Well, is to suppose that empirically sensed pyramid shapes of mountains can be looked at in terms of triangles, which point to a domain above themselves, like an X, which suppose a type of inductive inclination to see the world as having a geometrical relationship to that which is above and below it, inverse and opposite to it as well, but with emphasis on what is above it. To inductively assume a type of geometry to the universe whereby one might suppose that the earth is but a pearl at the bottom of an ocean, such that the earth is merely a dot in a grand geometrical intelligent ecosystem, or other intelligent physical but non-necessarily material entities, whereby an ecosystem with the universe is considerable at least, and in my case, as well as some other people, evidenced, via observances and interactions with unindigenous entities which have traversed into what was previously considered a strictly known domain, and known to be metaphysically natural and secular, i.e. outside of the secular domain. These entities exist outside of the secular domain. Within the commonly accepted domain of science, which is relegated by scientific testability and accepted limits of what is naturally variable and able to occur within this world, since I'm overtly assumptive that all that known doesn't have an inverse and opposite, and an inverse opposite. This paragraph is to help the reader come to the perspective without necessarily coming to the conclusions that I do. Namely, that which is the inverse of world has an opposite, not unlike the physics issuance of antimatter via Paul Dirac. We can come to illustrate an idea off of the secular to the secular's opposite, namely the mysterious unknown, yet predicated as Dirac describes. There's an illustration. If the M-like shape on the left is a mountain, this shape, which one can see as an empirical referent in their world, they might imagine that the mountain is pointed like a triangle. They might then mentally project a pyramid as a Platonic geometric overlay, their sight or thought of the mountain. The mountain might seem secular, occurring in metaphysical nature, with an imagined Platonic form representing it. and in much the same way that the secular is grounded in that which is non-secular, non-metaphysically natural, would be a type of supernatural, or motherly, I think I meant to say otherly world domain. I could imagine an extension of each line of my triangle where the inverse triangle exists. The inverse of the secular could be a type of inference to all that which is not natural. In other words, I have a metaphor from a Platonic stellation. This idea could function as a mere route to inform one's theos without necessarily informing their theology. Beyond antimatter per se, consider the inherent contradiction of Schrödinger's cat. Even if one takes umbrage with Schrödinger, one has conclusion it yields, a manifold of irony. On one thing that goes without saying is that item X, once known, without saying, and then I leave the E out. One thing that goes without saying is that item X, this X here, once known to the shared epistemology, X can travel backwards and forwards in time beyond the lifespan of the person speaking about this stellated X, and applied to the past, as if X always has applied. It can also speak as if the same stellated X, as right in front of you now, in front of your mind's eye, this slippage from what is now known to what must have always, to what will always be known, runs contradictorily to the paradigm which was shared historically and contemporaneously by others. Needs noting and saying, indexing. Slippage from what is apparent now to what must have always been goes without saying. Doesn't an intersection of intersecting triangles also go without saying? Of course, that itself is not a contradiction, as the verb to go is not the same as needs to. But since they intersect at all, we now see the intersection and not the contradictory wreck within the intersection. Imagine seeing a wreck within a road system whereby the intersection from above might appear like two intersecting triangles. The wreck that only ever referentially existed in the past is in some non-specific remembered date, but a wreck which was seen, a seen wreck with no recorded mimicked visual via a non-doctored photo, but just a testimony that one did in fact see a wreck which you yourself could only ever imagine, whereby if we drew independently of the other, we would necessarily be drawing two different wrecks, especially if the memory of the wreck is older than the listener of the story, such that they themselves were not also at that intersection that day seeing the same wreck. Instead, the viewer can imagine intersections and wrecks as geometric ideals and complex ideals and anti-ideal, perhaps as with the roads intersection noted above, a not quite geometric shapes, but nevertheless a close proximity to geometric shape. Now consider that the listener is the one case could remember a wreck which they saw, whether fictitious or not, and in another case simply imagine an idea of what an intersection per se is, denoting that there is a shared space where entities moving in from different orientations and axis moving through at differing times. This idea could be said to be time-space, yet this would merely be a type of pun from what space-time commonly refers to. The mere fact that the domain of grammar via syntax, aka the graphemine in lexical space using punctuation incongruous with one's imagining both an intersection as well as a grapheme, discongruity yielding a pun of meaning based on one's eyes, conditioning of reading left to right, which is standard wherever English. The splitting the chained together words in space-time was necessary in some manner, considering text which could be read top to bottom with no spaces between words or bidirectionally, as is Boustrophiedon, Boustropheden, to illustrate time as standing alone, away from, differing from space. Before the convention and formalization of modern writing and grammar occurred in English, the formalization of syntax was relocated to its modern proper spacing, opposed to haphazard placing in a lexical unit among other units, making a pseudo-syntax, which the assumption that a morpheme is discoverable. All of this above are examples of things that need to be said that also go without saying. It is also an obvious domain more of language studies than linguistics proper, as linguistic term stems from the movement of the tongue and that which is specifically spoken about auditorily, whereby the graphic version of language studies, the grapheme, this text, is favored. Because the strictness of what is researched about language has occurred conventionally in universities, potential dissertational topics concerning linguistics and semiotics keep the doctoral candidate within a reasonable orthodoxy of adhered to modern formalisms. Psychologically, that which goes without saying is that which parallels or runs concurrently with the activity of the meaningful content, whereby the orthodoxy of the grammar and punctuation and left to right read all informs the directionality of the content, so that it may travel well and communally be accepted as meaningful, while writing continues to self-inform itself to the reader. A speaker, orator of written text assumes that the listener must have an intersection with what is being spoken in order to derive some meaning from what is heard, whether or not what is nuanced via the grapheme, in the case that italicized or underlined text is not verbally conveyable to the listener as it is to the eyes of the reader reciting the text. And it is, of course, intersections where dissemination of content may pluralize as informational. Yet the being speaking it may also suffer a skewing of understanding the texts themselves. Conceptually, disjunctive meaning which arise from reading difficult texts may yield a style of mental disordering. The read a lengthy text often gets a reader into an expectation of the author's later chapters. Let's say, to recognize and contemplate and then mimic a complex author might later require a recovery from the skewing. Otherwise, a social separation may ensue, as well as a pathology of psychosis. One's fortitude and expediency to restabilize themselves back to communal orthodoxy become very important. The ability of recoverability of one's mother tongue's orthodox sense is imperative. It is also time-space determinant in the form of memory, paradigmatic memory. A long and protracted entanglement with complex entailments may occur in the non-recoverable mind. If a linguistic paradigm shift dominates and persists in the mind of person focused on language and its variants, a psychological disaster may ensue. A person may become lost within foreign domains without aligning to foreign orthodoxies. Anxiety may arise, and his desire to turn back time, share, might be noted by the observer or interlocutor who is attempting to make sense of the person's communication. Psychiatry suggests that a condition defined as such, a schizoaffective personality, has no possible recovery back to staying within rails of formal use. Philosophy, let's look at Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, number 142. It is only in normal cases that the use of a word is clearly prescribed. We are in no doubt what to say in this or that case. The more abnormal the case, the more doubtful it becomes what we are to say. And if things were quite different from what they actually are, if there were, for instance, no characteristic expression of pain, of fear, of joy, if rule became exception and exception rule, or if both became phenomena of roughly equal frequency, this would make our normal language games lose their point. It is important to consider that the exception becoming the rule and the disbanding of the rule is exactly what is under scrutiny here, although it is unconventional wholeheartedly to migrate our attention to the exception. It is necessary to open more robustly the domain of contradiction. Although traversing into this particular scrutiny is esoteric, the modern landscape of politics and difference of opinion, observation, and paradigm require it, for the sake of diplomacy, when engaging with those who exist as radically different from ourselves. Subchapter: A semi-formal example. Hoping that the wind of your soul is blown correctly back on course such that your soul's travel is not disgruntled and discontented, whereby at the end of your life you brandish a sword of battle against the Creator and yourself and the fates, instead of simply being glad that you were a witness to this travel. Regardless of the struggles, regrets, hells, and upsets, forgive God and fates and all others for you. For your ideal of I was freely willed laid against free will, and accept yourself, own yourself, in contra to God and or the powers that be. In any case, a constant retrograde and fear of life accompanied by self-disabling is a type of recrimination, of believing that in some cases two wrongs do make a right, i.e. I stop and ask directions, and I make two lefts opposed to two rights, and the road curves often and eventually aligns me with where I am attempting to go, or in other cases the error brought you back to the starting point, whereby you realize the error of your interpretation, of understanding, etc. Rivers curve, and the fates throw curveballs. Sometimes they even appear to drag you slavish willingly to an intersection of their presence in this world. I personally testify to this happening to my person, my body, my mind, my being. Beyond being authorally bound, not merely beyond a legal political ruler, but by a string of voices in your mind that appear there, when rubbing your retinas against my text left to right, as I knowingly intended it to be read, your sense-making abilities are tested. It's intended to show play, and play of variability, away from the tracks trending through your mind, as if your mind is incapable of reducing its environment of symbols into a cohesive understanding, such that otherly intelligences can emerge, and rip you throughout the cultural netting of memory of historic text and spontaneously allow your release from the canon of texts into the world unencumbered. The chronic reader of natural texts, when leaving their chained and boundedness to recriminating their own mind's meditative productions, are often afraid of other humans because they yearn to express what they have in their vault of acquired knowledge, but no longer know how to jive with people. Really cut loose and have fun interactions. That which is memorable within the individual who is authentic in both their laughter generated by themselves as well as others, opposed to winning a debate. Bracketed segment. Compare the non-identical cousins, Sam Harris and Ben Stiller. Certainly Sam Harris's seriousness towards philosophy could objectively be compared to the openness of Ben Stiller comedy. Harris jives more beta with the intellect than Stiller, and Stiller jives more beta with the viscera of people than Harris does. But Sam Harris would win a debate between the two, I imagine, but it wouldn't be a funny debate until Stiller did his blue thunder stare to counter Harris's eyebrow lift. The juncture or intersection from which we may move from the serious to the fun or the sacred to the profane is a twofold semi-formal happening. A circling. Readers who speak often and aloud are often fearful of the information they trust to disclose and remain thoughtful. Reading of Derrida's Of Grammatology, we find a pre-internet styling of some problems of linguistics, language analysis, which are appropriate to the modern 2017 status of preferred written texts, including basic font size and styles. The standardization of text helped to stabilize the institutionalized orthodoxy of text as signifieds of the phoneme, whereby the style of text does not lose its meaning in the read of the text itself, such that graffiti in the form of text exemplifies a destabilizing of the content of the signified into attributes associated with distortion capabilities of a text, such that an attempt to find meta-meaning in the sign dominates the non-distorted sign's content being the meaning found and registered when pronouncing phonically and lingual content of a word represented via color, the graffiti's expression. In 2017, a public ridicule against graffiti is still predominant under vandalism laws, but these laws cover over a type of accepted ordering of public space and media environments which help regulate the orthodoxy and stability of texts as signs which originally singly meant to represent or be stand-ins for the phonic. Consider graffiti as freedom of speech. Whence the engagement with the internet is freed up from 2D text typeface into more 3D video game style engagement, where internet engagement is synonymous with virtual reality, VR use, then 3D graffiti and meta-meanings via the graphic dis and ordering of text will become destabilized against the orthodoxy of acquiring the meaningful content found within an overlooked font structure of the pre-internet printing press. Even cursive writing had a standardized relationship to accepted texts, albeit to help the manual speed of writing to flow at a faster rate than hand printing. Cursive writing has had the first means of variance between that which was considered good and poor penmanship. It is also from a general acceptance of standard deviations and overt variations of cursive writing which yielded a tangential if not secondarily accompanying meaning to exert itself upon the visual read of such words. Derrida warns us about this type of visual orthographic destabilization in Of Grammatology, page 35. He mentions, quote, "First, the graphic form, image of words, strikes us as being something permanent and stable, better suited than sound to constitute the unity of language throughout time, though it creates a purely fictitious unity." Continues, "Strange, image. One already suspects that if writing is image and exterior figuration, this representation is not innocent. The outside bears with the inside a relationship that is, as usual, anything but simple exteriority. The meaning of the outside was always present from within the inside, imprisoned outside the outside, and vice versa." Page 38, quote, "That is why common orthography must be kept away from the notions of the linguist, and the multiplying of diacritical signs must be avoided." End quote. Although Derrida is working here to disclose the difference between the phoneme and the grapheme, and although he dissuades us from distorting via diacritical marks, most likely via punctuation and punctuational variants, quote, "space of inscription as an opening to the emission and to the spatial distribution of signs, to the regulated play of their differences, even if they are phonic." Derrida on page 45 of Grammatology speaks again in terms of the text being exterior to the interiority of the content found within the spoken phonic lingual process. Now it was indispensable to, this is a quote, now it was indispensable to the exclusion of writing as external systems that it come to impose an image, a representation, or a figuration, an exterior reflection of the reality of language." Next chapter. Exceptions to Wittgenstein's meaning is use argument. A caveat suggested by the author himself resides in section 43 of Philosophical Investigations. For a large class of cases, though not for all, in which we employ the word meaning, it can be defined thus: the meaning of a word is its use in the language. The relational use of the graphemes stand-in for the phoneme, this use of the graphemes via writing a text at all, is not variant to use per se. A meta-meaning from the font of a text may be said to be variable, but the content of vocalizing via a read of the text shows a strict conveyance of invariable content. This is to say that the meaning of a textbook is not found is that which is variable via signified object of the signifier book. As that is not so much a contested domain, but that the text book is invariant to one's articulated association between the written word book and the spoken word book, such that the use of either parallels the understanding of the other, specifically prior to examining the meaningful content of either word. The meaning of the phonic expression of the word could be fettered out back to meaning as use when speaking of the dialect of the speaker, yet the content of the word's meaning still holds, as the dialect is merely an underscoring of the meaning and not a variable of differing uses from which different meanings may arise. The domain is articulated here, whereby the question of indigenous tongue, or one's mother tongue, being the ordination from which to speak of differing dialects is known to be the same in one case and different in another. In the case of the differing mother tongue, one may invoke, or as Wittgenstein says, employ the word meaning, such as to describe an index that the grammatical difference between mother tongues may disjoin the word's use into grammatical play, such that use or play defines the meaning. In the case where both mother tongues are the same, namely English, the UK, in comparison to American English, the grammatical rules of orthodoxies have an institutionalized performance such that if the proper grammar is performed by either speaker, the textual stand-in of the word book does not have variable meaning from the verbal pronunciation of the word book. If meaning was use in all cases, then the variance between the written and the spoken representations of the word would be unstable, such that one might replace the phonic word book for variable written words, i.e. read or moving, such that the identity of the totality of a word becomes openly distributive into a corralling of what I meant by the text moving was really book, etc., etc. So the play between recognizing the written form of a specific language is parallel to that specific spoken language. Derrida speaks on this in page 37 of Grammatology. Quote, "The sciences and the arts have elected to live within this violence. Their progress has consecrated forgetfulness and corrupted manners. Saussure again anagrammizes Rousseau. Quoting Rousseau, the literary language adds to the undeserved importance of writing. The writing assumes undeserved importance. When linguists become embroiled in a theoretical mistake in this subject, when they are taken in, they are culpable. Their fault is above all moral. They have yielded to imagination, to sensibility, to passion. They have fallen into the trap of writing, have let themselves be fascinated by the influence of the written form, and that custom, that second nature. The language does have a definite and stable oral tradition that is independent of writing, but the influence of the written prevents our seeing this. We are thus not blind to the visible, but blinded by the visible, dazzled by writing. The first linguists confused language and writing." End quote. Paragraph circling back. The orthodoxy of a graphemene's ordering mimics the phoneme such that the spoken word, its declared purpose indeed confirms saying that goes without saying, page 29 of Grammatology, aka OG, which is contradictory. That which goes without saying in modern philosophical domain needs to be said. Page 48 through 49 of Grammatology. Quote, "Logic, in its general sense, is, as I believe I have shown, only another name for semiotics, the quasi-necessary, or formal doctrine of signs." End quote. Quote, like Husserl, Peirce expressly refers to it. It is a matter of elaborating, in both cases, a formal doctrine of the conditions which a discourse must satisfy in order to have a sense, in ordering to mean, even if it false or contradictory. The general morphology of that meaning is independent of all logic of truth. End quote. Here Derrida once again speaks of foundations of logic, grammar, and semiotics to a base level of the arithmetical association, the lowest common denominator of sensicality, the origin of what sensicality means at the exclusion of truth, a description of rationality itself opposed to describing what is or is not rational, that which is systemic versus that which is variable, without buttress nor bulwark. Consider Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, section 143. Let us now examine the following kind of language game. When A gives an order, B has to write down series of signs according to a certain formation rule. The first of these series is meant to be that of the natural numbers in decimal notation. How does he get to understand this notation? First of all, series of numbers will be written down for him, and he will be required to copy them. Do not balk at the expression series of numbers. It is not being used wrongly here. And here already there is a normal and abnormal learner's reaction. At first, perhaps we guide his hand in writing out the series 0 to 9, but then the possibility of getting him to understand will depend on his going on to write it down independently. And hence we can imagine, e.g., for example, that he does copy the figures independently, but not in the right order. He writes sometimes one times He writes sometimes one, sometimes another at random, and then communication stops at this point. Or again, he makes mistakes, which we have to mention in order to explain the significance. The importance of a concept are often extremely general facts of nature. Such facts as are hardly ever mentioned because of the great generality. Philosophical Investigations 157E in the order. The difference between this and the first case will of course be one of frequency, or he makes a systematic mistake. For example, he copies every other number, or he uses the series 0, I, 2, 3, 4, 5, like this I, 0, 3, 2, 5, 4. I'm as the author reading this, I'm going to stop and pause here. I believe for I he's indicating 1, so I'm going to repeat part of that. Okay, back to the text. Or he makes a systemic mistake. For example, he copies every other number, or he copies the series 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., like this 1, 0, 3, 2, 5, 4, etc. Here we shall almost be tempted to say that he has understood wrong. Notice, however, that there is no sharp distinction between a random mistake and a systemic one. That is, between what you are inclined to call random and what's systemic. Perhaps it is possible to wean him from the systemic mistake, as from a bad habit. Or perhaps one accepts his way of copying and tries to teach him ours as an offshoot, a variant of his. And here, too, our pupil's capacity to learn may come to an end. End quote. This writing of mine is to, at first, give over the reduction of the origin of sensibility to Derrida in full. Yet I do this prior to wanting to unyieldingly import its contra, namely, that the nature of meaning is questionable when one becomes insistent upon narrowly blinding oneself from this reductive classification of sense meaning. My attempt here is to radicalize an attack upon this purported foundation of rationale, to skew the understood description of that which holds sense to that which is merely non-senseless, to underscore this presumptively held conviction away from the semiotician, a type of radical declassifying the school of logic and semiotics, such that the most basic of understanding is at all times mentally obscurable. The always present mental obscuring sits as a potential skewing of sense away from its presumed origin. This is more easily done via the laying over upon the rudiments of one type of language's rudiments with a differently natured language. Compare. A pictographic ideographic language like Mandarin Chinese, individual graphemes may not have a corresponding spoken word, ideographic in nature. So one reads meaningfully these pictographic words, but do not have a sound in their head, the signified, as the ideographic image does not associate with one. This is a tremendous language difference than the iconic semi-dead language of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, which relies almost strictly on the pictogram's association and relationship necessarily to sound, to the phonic. A class of hieroglyphics has hieroglyphic elements, has a phonic association to the next hieroglyphic element, phonic glyphs, whereby each image is comparable to a letter in a modern alphabet. Each element is associated with to a phoneme. Each group composition of images coordinate the vocal lingual sound order, phoneme, sound, such that a word is composed of many images. The oddity of Egyptian hieroglyphic word creation is composed two images, like a snake, owl, feather, triangle, etc., where the image's visual association to its modern referent is what is ignored and non-corresponding in correspondence to an item in the empirical world. The image of an owl has nothing to do with an owl per se at all. Where with Chinese, the icons of a house refer directly to the idea of a house in some manner, and not necessarily to a phonic element, tentatively remaining ideographic in nature. Each language has pictorial elements. The first has no relation to sound and mostly a relation to the referent. The second has only image relation to sound and none with an empirical referent. Certain non-lyrical music still imbues a cultural entanglement to the sounds. Derrida knew his work could also be deconstructed, and it is this defoundational obscuring, which is not dissimilar to a duck laying a hen's egg, which is always mentionable. This allows a further separation of the logos to be parsed off from itself and left in an arch of self-comparison. Not what is different between ducks and chickens, but what is similar is what is regrounding. Derrida separates off the phonic verbal from the graphic textual in order to make comparative descriptions, where I attempt to reduce the origins of all human communication techniques to a spontaneous, conceivable general presentation. The presentation in exercise is akin to generalizing people when denoting any specific individual, almost to rupture fully the idea that an individual is preferenced less to typification. This is to say, to always first equate the individual to a category, type, or kind, as if the import of type-kind confusion is found only in recursive language's description of non-recursive languages. Consider Daniel Everett and the Piraha, people and Piraha language. From the Wikipedia, Daniel Everett has also concluded that because Piraha does not have a number words for counting, does not allow recursive adjective lists like the green wealthy hunchbacked able golfer, and does not allow recursive possessives like the child's friend's mother's house. A Piraha sentence must have a length limit. This leads to the additional conclusion that there is a finite number of different possible sentences in Piraha with any given vocabulary. Daniel Everett has also recently reinterpreted even the limit form of embedding in this example above as paratexis. He now states that Piraha does not admit any embedding at all, not even one level deep. End quote. To imagine being limited within a scope, a range, a primitive type of discourse, where language's self-analysis was yet to be conceived, was forced into translation. The ontology of reason would be substituted for an ontology of stalling, but such that a specific ontology of stalling was due to a preverbal wrench thrown into the machine, and in this very specific case is thrown in when one is talking about the rudiments of sense. Predictably, the modern recursive speaking mind, which accepts basic semiotic logical foundations, would find this technique merely obstructionistic and well as ad hoc. It is also the job of this writing to defame logical fallacies, as they are levied against this treatise. Tendencies to quiet discourse on the basis that one is mistakenly forcing complexity upon something, accepted as less complex, is antithetical to my inversion of Occam's razor. As much as Derrida denotes that which is stable and unstable, what is preferenced over what is not preferenced in language, in order to dislocate the logos in a reasoned fashion, it is my job to start with the discourse of difference and reapproach the lowest level of sameness and discourses on sameness as foundation in a way as to disassemble the rudiments to paratexis and morphine. This is to get the reasonable reader to remove their expectation of the rudiments and their colloquial normative yield, assuming like-kind sameness, rudimentary particulates of identical, i.e. x and x, as foundational is in need of automatization opposed to reduction. This is to reiterate the difference of space and or time of one x compared to another, as if to make the context of an x appearing first in one's eye's focus more about the specific time which it appeared than the content of x or its consideration as a variable. So, segmenting out, side note for the reader as the author, what I'm suggesting in this particular part of the text is not to focus on noting what an item is, but noting when one's focal point intersects the item that one is claiming the iteration or the reiteration or the re-remembering of said item. Such as rereading a specific text, you might note the timing then as a time scale. Okay, so back to the text here. As Derrida warns us, quote, that is why common orthography must be kept away from the notations of the linguist and the multiplying of diacritical signs must be avoided, end quote. I hope to overinflate the orthography of diacritical markers, punctuation, and signs themselves distributed unevenly. If if mile-wide words were printed upon mountaintops which only a satellite in Earth's orbit could read, make a flat image of, we would perhaps be more enthralled by the why and or how the writing was produced than the meaning of the word. In doing this, regardless of the possible translatable English words from which Derrida's native tongue French, the word orthography, was chosen, and American English is my mother tongue, I want to conflate the secondary definition of orthography with the first, namely that orthographic projection of onto language's texts, as well as visual descriptions of language's verbal phonic expression, into a type of musical mashup, kinetic graffiti, with varied and variable fonts and vocal exaggerations. To say another way, to do a type of clustered analysis of disparate occurrences of verbal content appearing on a visual graph. If a Bayesian analysis data points were each depicted with a unique visual graphic. The attempt at deriving meaning through a verbal cacophony is in order. Once again, the attempt is to bring forward a presentation of all possible linguistic expressions all at once in the most generalized form, as to preference the general when conventionally the individuated is insisted as being necessary, and vice versa. In a manner, the current social backlash of 2016 to 2017 against Derrida's legacy would be overshadowed and hampered via a completely disassociative, defoundational practice of alliteration and forthright attribution of the sophomoric towards the common sense and against the rudiments of foundational reasoning prescribed by this my writing. I would be taking the misappropriated heat off of Derrida, as his work alone seems to be misread and underread by PhDs and sophomores alike. Jordan Peterson, a clinical psychologist from Toronto, Canada, has engaged the internet in a viral fashion with many wrong-headed attributions to Derrida. Attributions to Derrida, mostly by exaggeration, his cultural influences instead of making specific critiques of his writing. And on a side note, I'm going to break and just speak freely on this. Jordan B. Peterson has made generalizations about Derrida's logocentrism. He's made generalizations about what Derrida's economic preferences are. I don't believe, has ever quoted page and line Derrida for the individual listener to go and seek out Derrida's writing, and then he's scapegoated. Jordan Peterson has utilized and stolen, I believe, a lot of aspects of what Derrida is promoting. He's applied them to himself, then he hates on his own master. Like, I believe Jordan Peterson has learned quite a bit, but he defames Derrida by not quoting him verbatim, and then he defames the idea of him as a postmodern author. Other people have made this same defamed notion about the postmodernists, but nonetheless, Jordan Peterson has defamed Derrida wrongly and unduly, and he is yet to, once again, quote page and line. And I have in other works, Spectres on Marx, made notation as to where Derrida is not promoting communism, even though he does a dialectical read and description of presumed dialectics with concerning Marx. This has been mistaken by Jordan Peterson. Okay, nonetheless, as side notes over, back to my text here. Structuralism and not I's deconstruction, both classical meaning as an analysis of propositions and structuralism, but also just structuralism. All three is an inclusion, an arbitrary number with regards to classical propositional logic, yet by virtue of also being a geometric form, in terms of three sides, we structuralists denote that the concept of three connected types of analysis, classical, structural, and both classical and structural, are three methods which imply a triangle, by virtue of being, here's a graphic, which is less than, this is pointing to this, shaped like this, right, meaning the idea this is the shape, where this line, the left of a triangle upward, let's say, a dash, if you will, from bottom to top is the connection between classical and structural methods of interrogating the language and metastructures, and the top to bottom downstroke slash of a triangle. From top to bottom is classical and structural, and merely structural. Structuralism of itself, in its form and form's history, is not about the truth or falsity of propositions or sets of propositions, but focus more upon relational aspects which compose a grammar and orthography, and the structure of a dialectic, the ontology of how people understand their communication with one another in the midst of many differences. Structuralism also deals with semantic modes and methods, as well as the atomized and compound natures of recursive meanings. So the up, left to right, up dash, and down top to bottom dash shape, like a hinge, brisor, implies a hypotenuse based upon how acute and obtuse the classical and structural methodic histories relate and disrelate to one another, so that a triangle might be inferred, and a geometric mapping of the shape of the structuralism which appears prior to its decentering. The destabilizing and deconstructive processes begin. The wobble of the shape of the triangle goes forward. The debasement of the initial geometric form from two-dimensional Platonic form of a triangle, and attempts to upset the structure as to perhaps remove the hypotenuse. This may be done for mere play and hobby or social upset, or it may be done in order to restructure the up-down, bottom to top, top to bottom portion of a triangle into a square. Or at least, meaning to remove the hypotenuse of a right triangle, let's say, and attach it to another mirrored triangle, hence making a square. Or at least to make an angle of the classical and structural relationship at 90 degrees, whereby a hypotenuse could be implied. Hence, a mirror of the hypotenuse would form a square, or square-like shape, like a diamond. Square as triangle in mere illustration. Note language as an inclusive multidimensional field of form, material and process of written and spoken word, but a yield to an active hypothesis, a hypothesis that acts like an activity of understanding, inclusive activity occurring within language, but also an outbound apprehension of language, an inductive thinking about the nature of language's form and structure, meaning semantic possibilities beyond, and antithetical to the inclusive activities, such as a temporarily put it that which is inclusive outside the bounds of one's consideration. An example is not found in content referring to spiritual content, but a X variable is focused upon, where X is X spiritual, such that X spiritual apprehension of language found within temporal atomization of semiotic entailments are distributed always for and towards the individual engaging its environment of semiotics, both within text and speech and within one's environment. Another way of saying this is to assume that all symbiosis within one's consciousness is grasp from t-shirt decals, elevator music, logos, street signs, license plates, packaging, etc., incongruous with all meanings one thinks about with regards to art, color, lighting, times of day, feeling about, looks on faces, etc., make up a flattened orthographic read, where one can now read the tea leaves of one's environment. A reiterative manifold of reverberating meaning and echo of one's thoughts is found stabilized within the individual's environment. At this stage, the inclusive variabilities are reconsidered and brought into play, but where the play is at a one-to-one relationship with the universe in perfect harmony. An overpopulated thrashing of signifieds comes to mind, echoing all environmental fields. If one sees a yellow wheat field, he can imagine yellow in a field where yellow is generalized and a field is merely a domain of visual space as signified, and no longer a referred to field of wheat via a referent. And all extensive exercising signifieds in order to understand all non-free play signs. Non-free because the domain is that of the individual, considering as many elements as possible, but when identifying with outside of self hypothetical speculative structures, then the interior inclusive variables, like the field of yellow, which is the signified, opposed to the referred to wheat field, the interior domain is more static than the exterior, as the exterior is being preferred at this point. And so, as in the case of altruism, the self is present, but not under self-evaluation. The individual allows themselves to absorb the indefinite and ongoing number of signifieds. The favoring of the exterior opposed to the interior is a matter of which domain is populated with more signifieds than the other, whether the signifieds are empirical and also include reference. An empathy with a type of solipsism, perhaps an article of solipsism not via paradigm, but by being the center as point of centers of all the symbolic, iconic, indexed, referenced signifieds. An oscillation among domains of consideration occurs, but only as subject of to the universe, instead of the ego-inflated station or pushback of the individual against the universe in separation from, while also being antagonists towards. If one scatters or detours all responsive aspects of ordinating structure of what one holds as a structure of domains, realms, and paradigms, or database of indefinite, ongoing, trivial matters, they become the whole dynamic, opposed to a fragmentary part and parcel to the whole. A materialist, or a materialist neuroscientist, might read a brain scan, EKG, which denotes hyperfiring of neurons in almost an explosive manner from a person having an ongoing category disjunct. The onslaught of ongoing data from one's environment and related metasets of signifieds which come to mind and ordinate a form become that of the structuralist camp, or of the structuralist camp. Sorry, for the reader. I'm going to start that paragraph again. The onslaught of ongoing data from one's environment and related metasets of signifieds, which come to mind and ordinate a form, become that of the structuralist camp, apprehended less than coherently, precariously, but with some structure nonetheless. Vague meanings might be reinterpretable as explicit meanings, and all that remain as non-relatable signifieds, which fall back in the mundane domain of mere propositional and semantic elements. That which resides in any book not opened, over there, which one will never know, yet know there is some structure in that book's text nonetheless. The domain of the propositionally coherent, classical propositional logic is marginalized, while subsumed groups of meaning become the dominant aspect of one's focus. This onslaught might, though, threaten the ability of the individual to decipher what is meaningful and what is merely trivial, such that the wave of signifieds crashes upon the person, dominates over them, and diminishes their very organismal ability to register the information, or register it in any meaningful way. Speaking to you is the structure squared, multiplied to itself, amplified before being broken and deflated. When the cry of the soul mediates through the abyss of signs, at first as subject in slavery to the individual, and secondly, after the slavery dissipates, or after having been hunting the meaning of words where words are the examiner's slave, one becomes hunted by the universe, such that the universe subjugates the one, the self, you. Then one recommands a second center. The center is a reflection of the lost ego without being the lost ego itself. The egonic re-engorgement excludes and denies the dominance of sign symbols back to the domain of Saussure's initial with all of its old sophomoric yet sophisticated for its time pre-digital information age attributes. This above is when the hunter becomes the hunted, post-humility towards the universe of sings is a new self-positioning. Sorry, that's probably signs. I'm going to start that again, pardon. The above is when the hunter becomes the hunted, post-humility towards the universe of signs is a new self-positioning with new knowledge, understanding of which experience one felt in command of while being inert accordance to an old identity, past identity. When one reaches that point in life where their life will never be the same from there on out, a Rubicon has been traversed. This is a knowledge, scary and unfamiliar at first, of responsive and reflective intelligence within one's consciousness, or the universe itself, such that all that was true but trivial after a structural fault reconstructs, and a personal reconstruction begins. If no reconstruction happens, then madness maintains. Some people may prefer to have their madness maintained for the sake of denoting truthfully and well a historic story of themselves, and for others. Isn't there a virtue in maintaining pockets of madness simply to denote, index, unresolved dissonance? One can say, if I posit that the soul is embedded and contingent to the body as well as to a higher master, dominate nature, or supernatural force or entity, then yes. For the case of the person, the soul is contingent to the body and God and Theos, and only available as being accessible to the living. And for those who imagine otherwise, those who imagine a soul that lives or exists in the hereafter, the world universe accords itself to that concept, for the beings imagining it. But this domain of thinking is relegated to that of a conviction about the extrapolated hypothesis, for merely holding a stable paradigm of that which one has temporarily never observed of themselves is left within that which is understood in relationship to reference in the world. Even with someone claiming to see ghosts and speak to spirits with an underlying assumption, conviction, that these entities are dead ancestors or dead people, is a type of consideration which a mind can conceive. Yet to make the entity experienced, self-same, or akin to oneself, as an accompanying conviction, is a type of bulwarked, an accepted bulwarking process. The history of religion, other people's claims, propositions unwitnessed to ourselves, these other entities are derivative of us, humankind. Where it is perfectly reasonable for one who experiences otherly entities to imagine that they themselves have no relationship of kinship with them, or do they themselves have a transcendental soul, they can conceive and hold fast to the conception that their body and temporal biology itself is the totality of one's soul's life. A love of the destabilized conviction, the not knowing, radical skepticism, a love of the unknown and unknowable, yet with an accompanying belief, faith in ultimate teleonomic destiny. A type of faith is required for this self-stabilizing relationship with all inherent signifieds, trusted as holding solid from this life to the next Y domain, where Y domains are non-living, non-biologically living presences, aka a supposition of a disembodied soul. Contradiction is that which is always found outside of the current sets of possible fields, that which is diffuse without an outer limit, running contra to the accessible and sound field domains, which are grounded via well-embedded and hence tentatively trusted as being non-mutable, or if mutable, not beyond an explicit and discrete boundary limit. When one finds themselves bonding with their own mythic path, which has a personalized sense to it, it may be one reading into their environment too much. But it nevertheless makes a type of sense, a mythic path, has, like holding to an ethnos in ongoing variability in life, a rationality, a measure, a type of rationale to it. It maintains a rationale of sorts while not being generally rational within the general orthodoxy of civilized behavior. One's mythic path may be informed by reading into one's environment, where too much is a matter of depth and rarely a matter of falsehood or falsifiability. A mythic structure followed would require that at least some rules are followed which break other rules. Hence, a sociopathology or aberration could be communally objectively observed. Yet, if preference is towards the individual self, i.e. you, the reader, and me, the rereader as well, then following one's heart or soul's path may run roughshod against and in contra to what the conventions, customs, norms, and mores, contrasting those who abide within these trends. Derrida speaks non-mythically about this type of topic, but speaks about the trace of one's history as privileged with anticipation. In Of Grammatology, page 66, quote, "If the trace refers to the absolute past, it is because it obliges us to think a past that no longer be understood. And, quote, to be sure, what is anticipated in protection does not sever the present any less from its self-identity than does that which is retained in the trace. But if anticipation were privileged, the irreducibility of the always already there and the fundamental passivity that is called time would risk effacement." We're going to end this is the end of Embedded Contradiction, the end of the fifth reading of Embedded Contradiction, an issuance of dissonance into contemporary philosophy, an introduction to Modular Truth. I appreciate you listening, and we will continue from there next time. All right.